May all that is said and done be in your name and to your glory, Lord Christ Jesus. When I looked at the gospel passage preparing for this sermon, I read what Jesus said to those who came to him to ask to sort out a family financial difficulty. "Don't ask me," said Jesus. "I'm not the one to help you get rich." Then he tells them a parable that's about some old man trying to store up enough riches on earth to become secure. But of course, God's in charge. The man dies and all his work comes to nothing. The message is clear. Don't follow Jesus if you want to get rich and prosperous. He is not the right person for you if that's what you want. So the sermon falls into my lap. Riches, ignore them. It's going to be an easy week. But I think about that pension slip that arrived the other day. I think about my decision to add voluntary contributions to the pension. I think about the hours, to be honest, the days that have put into planning for our future and making sure we was enough to live on in retirement. It's not so easy now. This easy sermon is beginning to speak to me. Of course, I could say, I didn't ask for a pension. It's part of my work agreement. It's part of the society that I live in. It's even how we look after each other. We make sure that we're okay so that we're not a burden on somebody else. It's the sensible thing to do, to plan for the future. But it doesn't answer my dilemma. How can I preach on Jesus' words, yet still live in a society which so compromises what I actually do, which is always encouraging me to prepare for the future, to put a bit by? Are Jesus' words just too impractical? And if I preach that sermon about ignoring the need to look after ourselves, would there be kind of, people who went home think, that was okay, very nice, but in the real world, you've got to look after yourself. We've got to do this or that. And they'd have a point. In the last week or so, I've been reading a book by Robert Graves, I, Claudius, written loads of years ago. Perhaps you remember the television series starring Derek Jacobi as Claudius, the member of the imperial family who survives the terrifying reigns of Emperor Caesar Augustus and his scheming wife Livia, then Tiberius, then Caligula, and finally Claudius himself becomes a god. I was enjoying the book, and then it just got too gory. Too many hundreds, thousands of people killed, executed at whim, either because they'd slightly offended someone in power, or they were related to somebody who'd slightly offended somebody in power, or they were feeding the crowds to keep them satisfied in the great shows which were taking place, or the hundreds of thousands of animals killed for sacrifices and in the games. It was sickening. And by the end, I was flicking over a few pages at a time. The casual execution of all those people. Life was so cheap, at the mercy of those who had power and authority to take life away at a whim. And at exactly the same historical moment, there's this preacher in Palestine saying, care for the weak and the vulnerable. Look after the needy, not yourself. Don't make provision for yourself. Don't try and store up as many riches as possible. What a pointless, insignificant message that sounds. One voice against the Roman Empire. And yet, 200 years later, at least a tenth of the empire, the great mighty Roman Empire, worshipped that person. And a few hundred years after that, the Roman Empire collapsed and fell. And other empires and societies have again tried to live their lives by power, by accumulation of wealth, by the exercise of might. And they've had their time in the sun and then have collapsed. And people still worship Jesus. Perhaps I thought to myself, the real world is Jesus' world, the real world that endures, is the place that he describes. The real world is not a world of power and riches. The real world is the word of Jesus. But how to put ourselves in that world and not in the society which so often surrounds us and to which we are so often obedient? I looked at the reading from the letter to the Colossians as well. And what strikes you immediately when you start reading that is the words, "For you died." Might be a bit of a shock if you think your heart is still beating and you're breathing, but the words are quite stark and straightforward. You have died. The words in the letter to Paul, as in many of Paul's letters, the word for you is plural. So perhaps we ought to say, as they would in Northern Ireland, yous are dead. You died. You, the community. You, the Christian community. You've died with Christ and are now able to live a new life, a resurrected life. It's a group of people that Paul is addressing. So perhaps it makes our preparations for the future, well, it puts them into perspective. There's no use preparing for our death. We've already died. In God's time, and from God's point of view, which is the real world, remember, the future's already been made secure. Our lives have already been made safe. So how does that help me make decisions about the future? Providing for children and those we love, pensions and so on. It does encourage me to have confidence in God's provision for me. To remember that what I might do is minuscule, even insignificant, in comparison to what God has already done. I might pray for guidance about particular actions, about how to use the money that I have, what to do about the future. But my prayer for guidance is so that I might be God-led and pay more attention to what God says than my own initiative, the things I think I can do. Jesus, clearly, in his world, in the real world, Jesus is the person to listen to, not for some financial advice, not to find out how to be rich and powerful, but Jesus is the person to listen to find out how to be secure in the future.